The ocean can look peaceful right before everything goes wrong. Hi, I'm Christopher, and today I'm covering terrifying shark attacks that turned ordinary moments into complete nightmares. From a family who kept sailing deeper into shark-filled waters because nobody wanted to turn back to a commercial sea urchin diver who came face to face with an aggressive blue shark. It was August 8th, 2015. The Pacific Ocean, approximately 40 nautical miles off Guadalupe Island, Mexico. The water was clear and the seas were flat. Conditions were calm in every direction. There was nothing between the vessel and the horizon. Richard Hargrove was 54 and worked as a property developer in Newport Beach, California, and the people who knew him well said he was the kind of man who decided he wanted something and did not stop until he had it, no matter what it cost or what anyone said. He had been on boats his whole life, chartered trips, crude passages, weekends on other people's yachts, and at some point he had decided he needed one of his own. He saved for 3 years alongside his business income and bought a $2 million sailing yacht and named it after his wife. He hired a captain with 22 years of blue water experience and 11 Baja coastal passages behind him. 6 weeks before the voyage, the captain recommended a coastal route staying within 30 nautical miles of shore and formally advised against transiting the Guadalupe aggregation zone during peak season. Richard listened to all of it and still would not change the route because the sharks were part of why he wanted to go there. The captain resigned. Richard hired a replacement with less experience and no prior operational experience in the Guadalupe aggregation zone, and he never told him what the first captain had explained. A man with 22 years walked off that boat because of this route. I genuinely cannot understand hiring his replacement and keeping that conversation to yourself. Richard's wife Carol was 51, and his son Blake was 28, and the three of them set off on what was planned as a 10-day cruise. The first few days were easy and relaxed, with good food and music on deck and long afternoons watching the water. And Richard had been enjoying himself so much that the warning the first captain had given him had started to feel like something that belonged to a different conversation. No sharks had been sighted since they entered the aggregation zone, and the ocean looked calm and empty and safe. On the afternoon of day 4, at around 2:15, Blake decided to go in the water. The cruise was about halfway through, and he wanted to feel the open ocean before it was over, and since nothing had been spotted, he climbed down and swam away from the hull. No formal in-water safety protocol or lookout was in place. Carol stayed on deck and Richard was below, and Blake said he would be quick. At 2:23, a shark struck Blake from below in a vertical approach with no warning. Carol had been watching from the rail and waiting for him to surface when the water around him erupted. She could see him from where she stood, screaming and fighting to get back to the surface, and she screamed and called for Richard. Richard came up from below and saw Blake in the water and went over the side himself without stopping, entering the water within seconds. I have to be honest, I do not know what I would do in that moment. I would like to think I would know better. I do not think I would. Blake was still at the surface when Richard reached him, but the water around them was already heavily discolored, and Blake was still moving erratically, which kept the shark in the area. The shark had not broken off. It had already begun feeding, and it came back before Richard could get his son to the hull, returning from below the same way it had the first time. Blake went under. The blood concentration in the water by that point was significant, and Richard was directly inside it when the shark came through again. It struck him from the side with enough force to roll him under the surface. He came up once and then did not come up again. The captain sent a mayday at 2:26, and it was acknowledged within a minute, with rescue estimated at approximately 2.5 hours out. He attempted to maneuver the vessel closer to where the two men had gone under, and during that maneuver, the prop shaft seal, which the pre-voyage survey had flagged as showing early corrosion fatigue, failed under the load. Water began entering the vessel through the shaft housing. The automatic bilge pump activated, but the ingress rate exceeded its capacity within several minutes, and a secondary compartment the captain could not access or isolate began flooding. The yacht began listing to port. Carol was at the rail, trying to see what was happening in the water below, standing on a wet deck with an increasing port list, reducing stable footing. The yacht shifted, and she had nothing firm to hold, and she went into the water. The sharks that had been drawn toward the blood and surface disturbance were still in the area. They also attacked her. She did not come back up. By 2:44, the captain transmitted an update reporting the stern was going under. He moved to the bow and held position. Rescuers reached the vessel at 4:51 and recovered him. He was the only person on board. Blake Hargrove was 28, Richard Hargrove was 54, and Carol Hargrove was 51. None of them were recovered from the water. The investigation reviewed the route selected. the resignation of the original captain, the decision to transit the Guadalupe aggregation zone during peak season without disclosing known risk factors to the replacement captain, and the deferred maintenance on the prop shaft seal identified in the pre-voyage survey. The original captain provided a statement and did not elaborate beyond the facts. The yacht was eventually salvaged, repaired, and offered at auction. It did not sell. It was renamed and added to a rental fleet. He wanted to see the sharks. He chose to be where they were. It was June 17, 2016, and the golden light stretched across Keauakapu Beach in Maui, where the seabed sloped gradually before meeting darker reef structures farther offshore. Those deeper reef zones were patrolled by tiger shark, whose movements brought them periodically into shallower water as daylight faded. Elira Santos, 28, a dental receptionist from Albuquerque, had never traveled abroad before. With her husband Jonah, 31, a cautious HVAC technician she had saved meticulously for their Hawaiian honeymoon. Just 3 days into their marriage, they splurged on a Sunset Beach photo shoot with a freelance photographer who offered discounted rates for off-peak slots, promising romantic shots in waist-deep water, a comfort for the couple, neither of whom were strong swimmers. I don't know about you, but knowing that deeper reef structures sit just beyond the shoreline always gives me pause. Tiger sharks are among the ocean's most adaptable predators, with adults reaching lengths of 10 to 14 feet and capable of exerting immense bite force, sufficient to cut through bone and hard shells. The photographer positioned them several yards from shore, in calm, shallow water, where the depth reached waist level. At that distance, most people would assume they were completely safe. Elira's flowing white dress created an ethereal effect as it floated around her legs, and Jonah had overcome his initial awkwardness about posing for professional photos. The session had been progressing smoothly for nearly 15 minutes when the photographer suggested more dynamic shots involving splashing and movement to capture the golden light reflecting off disturbed water. Several beachgoers had stopped to watch the romantic scene unfold, some taking their own photos of the picturesque couple. What none of them realized was that a tiger shark, measuring roughly 12 feet in length, had been methodically hunting along the reef edge since late afternoon, following its instinctual pattern of moving into shallower waters as daylight faded. Their repeated splashing and the contrasting movement of Elira's white dress against the darker water created exactly the type of irregular disturbance that triggers investigative behavior in tiger shark. Now that part really stands out to me. The attack came without warning as Jonah lifted Elira for what was meant to be the final shot of their session. The tiger shark surged upward from deeper water, propelled by rapid tail strokes as it crossed from the reef edge into the shallows. The impact threw Elira off balance, and the shark's jaws closed on her left hip and upper thigh. The photographer witnessed the sudden strike, though there was no warning before the predator's attack. The shark's serrated teeth tore through the thigh and pelvis, causing catastrophic damage and likely severing the femoral artery. Elira's scream was cut short as the force of the attack pulled her underwater, and bleeding began immediately from the inflicted wound. Jonah's initial confusion turned to horror as he realized what was happening beneath the churning surface. He lunged forward, grabbing Elira under her arms and attempting to pull her away from the shark, but the predator's grip was absolute. I can't imagine what that moment must have felt like for him. The surrounding water darkened rapidly with blood as the shark released its grip and moved back into deeper water, leaving Elira in the shallows with critical injuries. Elira emerged from the water unconscious, her body going into immediate shock from catastrophic blood loss. Jonah dragged her toward shore, screaming for help as blood poured from the massive wound in heavy, pulsing streams that left a trail across the sand. An off-duty firefighter among the beachgoers rushed forward with towel, attempting to apply pressure to the wound, but the injury was too high on her torso and too severe to control with basic first aid. The femoral artery had been completely severed, and her body was losing blood faster than any emergency response could address. A witness called 911, but traffic delays meant paramedics didn't reach the remote beach access for several minutes. Elira had lost consciousness shortly after reaching shore and went into cardiac arrest soon after. Despite aggressive resuscitation efforts, she was pronounced dead from hypovolemic shock, secondary to massive trauma and blood loss. I can't help but wonder if stricter guidelines for offshore photo sessions might have helped. Elira and Jonah were careful, inexperienced swimmers, yet the unpredictability of tiger sharks makes me question how preventable this truly was. The incident prompted immediate beach closures and increased patrols over several days, drawing widespread media attention, though many details were later limited or removed from public reports for privacy. The photographer ceased offering ocean sessions and returned exclusively to land-based wedding photography. The couple's carefully planned dream vacation had lasted exactly 4 days, ending in the type of tragedy that transforms a paradise destination into a place of unimaginable loss. It was August 22nd, 2015, and the water off Shelly Beach was running cold, green, and murky, the way it does in midwinter on the KwaZulu-Natal coast. The surge was running at 6 to 10 feet. Visibility was poor. The sky was flat and gray in the way that makes the ocean look like it has no bottom. Paul Engelbrecht was 48 years old, a construction project manager from Pretoria with 16 years of diving behind him. His log showed more than 380 dives, including prior dives at Protea Banks, and he held advanced rescue and nitrox certifications. He had dived Protea Banks twice before. He knew the site. He understood its conditions and its risks. His wife described him as someone who was not reckless. He was simply a man who loved diving and had booked a week on a coast he knew well. The dive group that morning consisted of Paul, 6 other recreational divers, and 2 guides, a lead dive master with more than a decade of experience at Protea Banks, and an assistant guide. The pre-dive briefing covered current direction and expected surge, buddy assignments, torch signaling protocol if separated, regrouping procedures, and standard shark conduct. Paul was paired with another experienced diver. They descended together at the back of the group at 9:41 a.m. The descent was unremarkable. Visibility was 13 to 16 feet, poor but consistent with winter conditions at the site. The group reached the reef at 92 feet and began their traverse eastward along the pinnacle line. The separation happened at approximately 9:55 a.m., 14 minutes into the dive. A surge came through from the east. It hit the group without warning and scattered them off the reef line simultaneously. Paul's buddy grabbed the reef edge and held on, his torch beam swinging wildly through the disturbed water. When the surge passed and the sediment began to settle, he swept the beam in a full arc. Paul was nowhere to be found. The buddy held position for 30 seconds, sweeping his torch, looking for a light response. Nothing came back. He finned toward where Paul had been and swept again. Visibility had been reduced to 10 feet. He signaled toward the main group, which had regrouped around the lead dive master, and indicated a missing diver. Paul, separated and unable to reestablish contact, followed his training. He signaled with his torch. He waited 30 seconds. He signaled again. No response came. He checked his air and depth. 92 feet, bottom time 14 minutes, and made the decision to ascend. It was the correct decision. Bull sharks are commonly present at Protea Banks during winter. They are large, fast, and capable of striking from below with minimal warning. Bull sharks are ambush capable and frequently approach from below and behind, using reduced visibility and vertical contrast to conceal approach. Somewhere between 20 and 15 meters of depth, Paul Engelbrecht was struck from below. The impact was immediate and disorienting. A large bull shark struck him from below and bit into the right side of his torso. There was no prolonged struggle. The force of the impact and the catastrophic damage to the thoracic cavity incapacitated him almost instantly. By the time the blood plume spread through the water column above the reef, the animal was gone. The lead dive master saw the blood cloud first, a dense, dark bloom appearing in the water column above and slightly east of the group's position. He signaled an immediate abort and began ascending. The assistant guide and 2 divers alongside him. They surfaced and observed blood dispersing on the current. There was no sign of Paul. The dive boat was alerted by radio. The captain brought the vessel to their position within 4 minutes and began a coordinated search of the surrounding water. Nothing was visible from the surface. A search operation was initiated through local marine rescue services. His body was recovered approximately 2.5 hours later along the projected drift line southeast of the reef. The coroner's report documented a single catastrophic bite wound to the right side of the torso, consistent with a large bull shark striking from below in an ambush posture. The strike had disrupted the right lung, major thoracic vessels, and the liver. The injuries were not survivable. Death was determined to have occurred within minutes of the strike due to rapid incapacitation from catastrophic thoracic injuries. A post-incident review conducted by the dive operator in cooperation with the Sharks board found no negligence on the part of the crew. The separation was attributed to an unexpected surge event in already reduced visibility. The operator voluntarily suspended charters to Protea Banks for 2 weeks following the incident and reinforced separation protocols in subsequent briefings. Paul was buried in Pretoria the following week.
The morning of April 14th, 2014 dawned with perfect conditions at southeast Farallon Island, California. The Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly under a brilliant blue sky, with crystal clear visibility that marine researchers dream of. The water temperature held steady at 58 degrees Fahrenheit, ideal for the California sea lions that called these rocky outcroppings home. Emma Rodriguez, 24, couldn't have asked for better conditions for her thesis research dive. The UC Santa Barbara graduate student had been awake since 4:30 a.m., her excitement barely contained as she prepared her equipment on the research vessel. Emma was intensely passionate about marine biology, methodical in her research, and fearless when it came to underwater exploration. She had completed her scientific diving certification 18 months earlier and had already logged 89 research dives, mostly in the familiar waters of Monterey Bay. Working under Dr. Patricia Chen's lab, Emma was conducting her third dive at the Farallones, focusing on California sea lion foraging behavior for her master's thesis. The Farallon Islands, located 27 miles west of San Francisco, were known as the Galapagos of California for their incredible biodiversity. What made these waters so rich in marine life also made them incredibly dangerous. The Farallones sit directly in the path of the California Current, creating an explosion of marine life that attracts the ocean's most feared predator. Massive colonies of seals and sea lions, over 100,000 individuals during peak season, hauled out on the rocky shores. Great white sharks patrol these waters with evolutionary perfection honed over 400 million years. These apex predators can grow up to 20 feet in length and weigh over 5,000 pounds. Their torpedo-shaped bodies capable of explosive bursts of speed reaching 25 miles per hour. Their most terrifying feature is their mouth, lined with up to 300 serrated triangular teeth that continuously regenerate throughout their lifetime. At 6:45 a.m., Emma made her fatal mistake. She descended to 25 feet, positioning herself directly above a seal haul-out ledge during peak predation hours, the ring of death that occurs between 6 and 8 a.m. when seals return from overnight foraging trips, exhausted and vulnerable. Wearing her standard black wetsuit and carrying a bright yellow data slate, Emma remained perfectly still 15 feet above the seal colony, methodically counting and photographing the animals. What Emma didn't know was that an 18-foot female great white had been patrolling these waters since dawn. This massive predator, weighing approximately 4,500 pounds, had already made 2 unsuccessful attacks on seals and was in an aggressive hunting state. Female great whites are typically larger than males and more aggressive, especially during feeding periods. Great whites possess extraordinary sensory capabilities that make them perfect killing machines. They can detect a single drop of blood in 25 gallons of water from up to 3 miles away. Emma's silhouette against the surface, combined with her black wetsuit and methodical movements, perfectly mimicked a resting seal. Her yellow data slate, flashing in the sunlight, may have resembled the pale belly of an injured seal. The attack came with devastating precision. The shark approached from the deep channel below, accelerating to its maximum speed of 25 miles per hour in the last 20 feet. The attack was so violent that the shark's momentum carried both predator and prey several feet above the surface in an explosion of white water. The massive jaws, measuring 18 inches across, delivered the initial bite to Emma's torso with the full force of 1,800 psi. The serrated teeth, each up to 2.5 inches long, sliced through her wetsuit, flesh and bone with surgical precision. Her dive partner, working 150 feet away, heard the distinctive surface disturbance and saw the explosive white water that marked a great white attack. The research vessel crew activated emergency protocols immediately, but Emma had sustained catastrophic damage to major organs and arteries. The great white's bite had crushed ribs, punctured lungs, and severed major blood vessels. She was recovered in just 4 minutes, but the massive internal bleeding and shock had already begun shutting down her vital systems. Emma died before the Coast Guard helicopter could reach the mainland. Her promising career in marine science cut tragically short during peak predation hours in the world's most active great white hunting ground.
It was September 4th, 2015, and the calm coastal waters concealed one of the world's densest great white shark population, drawn by nearby seal colonies just beyond the swimming area. Galen Varga, 78, a retired South African railways worker, swam daily along Fish Hoek Beach in slow, careful breaststroke, never venturing beyond waist-deep water. If I were in his position, that depth would probably feel safe enough too. A childhood near the Danube had instilled a lifelong belief that swimming prevented arthritis, and he limited his swims to roughly 200 yards along the same stretch. Though he'd seen sharks over the years, he dismissed them as distant, isolated sightings, while his wife watched from their balcony each morning, reassured by his methodical routine. The morning conditions at Fish Hoek Beach appeared ideal, with minimal wave action and excellent visibility, extending well beyond the swimming area. Great white shark are apex predators that can reach lengths of 20 feet and weights exceeding 5,000 pounds. The local shark spotter program had issued no warnings that morning, and the observation posts stationed on the surrounding hills reported no unusual activity in the bay. However, several dog walkers later mentioned seeing unusual splashing activity near Seal Island approximately 30 minutes before Galen entered the water, suggesting that hunting activity had been occurring in the area. Galen followed his established routine, despite noticing that fewer people than usual were swimming that morning, a detail that should have indicated heightened caution among locals familiar with shark behavior pattern. Personally, that's the kind of small detail I would probably overlook too. As Galen waded into the water at his customary spot, the calm surface conditions provided perfect visibility for both swimmer and predator. He moved methodically to his preferred depth of approximately 4 feet, where the water reached his lower chest, and began his usual slow progression parallel to the beach. Unknown to Galen, a subadult great white, measuring an estimated 10 to 12 feet, had been patrolling the deeper waters beyond the swimming area since dawn, likely attracted by the scent trails from recent seal activity. The shark's enhanced sensory system had detected Galen's electrical signature and irregular movement pattern from significant distance, triggering the investigative behavior that characterizes great white encounter with unfamiliar prey. The attack began without warning, as Galen paused to rest approximately 80 feet from shore, treading water in the chest-deep zone he considered safe, though the nearby drop-off and seal activity meant larger predators could occasionally pass closer to shore than expected. The great white approached from behind and below, its massive form invisible against the darker water until the moment of impact. The force of the strike briefly lifted Galen partially above the surface before the shark's jaws closed around his torso, its upper teeth penetrating his back while the lower jaw gripped his chest and abdomen. The impact drove both predator and victim through the water as the shark's powerful body weight compressed Galen's ribcage and spine. The crushing force of the bite fractured multiple ribs and caused immediate internal hemorrhaging, while the shark's instinctive thrashing motion created additional trauma to his internal organs. Galen's body went limp almost immediately as the shark's teeth penetrated his back and likely damaged his spine, eliminating any possibility of struggle or escape. The shark's grip lasted only a few seconds before it released, a typical response during an initial strike. Blood spread rapidly through the surrounding water in expanding dark cloud as the predator circled back briefly before departing into deeper water. From a nearby balcony with a view of the shoreline, Lenka witnessed the water around her husband suddenly erupt in violent splashing, accompanied by an unmistakable dark discoloration, spreading rapidly through the previously clear water. Her immediate screaming alerted other beachgoers, several of whom began running toward the water's edge, while simultaneously reaching for mobile phone. I can't imagine what it would feel like to realize what you're seeing from that distance. When the shark finally departed, Galen's lifeless body surfaced face down in the bloodied surf approximately 60 feet from shore. The attack lasted less than 2 minutes from initial strike to the shark's departure, but the damage was catastrophic and immediately fatal. A nearby fisherman contacted emergency services, while local shark spotter volunteers arrived at the scene within minutes. Paramedics reached the beach shortly afterward, but Galen had suffered massive trauma incompatible with life and was pronounced dead upon examination. Sadly, by then, the situation was already beyond help. The coroner's preliminary assessment indicated death resulted from massive internal trauma, severe spinal trauma, and exsanguination caused by multiple penetrating wounds to the torso. The incident prompted a brief beach closure while authorities reviewed safety protocols, added shark warning signs, and increased early morning patrols. The precautions were necessary, but I can't help wondering if stronger warnings or restricted access could have prevented this. From all accounts, her husband was careful. This was a tragedy no one could truly foresee. It was February 17th, 2016, Neptune Islands, South Australia. A shark cage diving vessel running a scheduled excursion at one of the most well-known great white shark sites in the world. The water was cold and clear. A large great white shark, estimated at around 15 feet, had been circling the cage for the better part of the session, passing within inches of the bars on repeated loops. Elliot Grant was 27. He worked in construction and had booked the trip as part of a group holiday with friends. He had no prior experience with large, predatory sharks. He was not there because of a long-held interest in marine life. He was there because it was on his list of things to do that most people would not. His friends were watching from the deck above. But what started as joking among them gradually turned into a cash dare. By the time the bet was made, it had reached $500. The objective was simple. Open the latch, step outside briefly, come back in. I wonder what they were thinking. A 15-foot great white actively circling, and the dare was to open the door. Before entry, the crew ran a full safety briefing. The rules were explained clearly and physically demonstrated. One rule carried more weight than the others. They were told not to open the cage latch underwater. Keep all body parts inside the cage at all times. The latch was accessible from inside, as was standard for that cage design at the time. Elliot heard the briefing, acknowledged it, and entered the cage. Approximately 20 minutes. Into the dive, the shark was still circling. It had been making close passes for most of the session. Nothing had gone wrong. Elliot reached for the latch and opened it himself, the cage door outward. He leaned his upper body outside into open water. His arm was now fully exposed beyond the cage barrier. The shark was a 15-foot great white that had been circling in actively baited water for the better part of 20 minutes. It was not a passive animal waiting to be observed. The moment Elliot's arm was exposed in open water, the animal responded without delay. The bite was single, immediate, and severe. The jaw closed on the exposed arm with a force that severed major vessels instantly. Blood loss began at a rate that nothing on board could address. The crew above saw the breach as it happened, but could not reach him before contact occurred. They pulled him back through the cage opening and onto the vessel as quickly as the injury allowed. He was on deck within minutes. The vessel was miles from shore. What was available on board was not built for vascular trauma at that level. Emergency services were contacted the moment he was out of the water. The bleeding could not be controlled during the transit. Elliot Grant died on board before the vessel reached land. He was 27 years old. His body was returned home. Post-incident review confirmed that the cage latch had been opened deliberately by Elliot, that the safety briefing had been conducted in full, that the rule had been clearly communicated and physically demonstrated, and that the cage barrier had been functioning correctly before his interference. The operating company replaced the interior accessible latch mechanism with a crew-operated external lock that participants could not reach from inside the cage. No regulatory action was taken against the operator. It was February 11th, 2014, and Kaanapali Beach on the island of Maui was living up to every photograph ever taken of it. The water was the color of liquid glass. The sand was white and fine enough to squeak underfoot. It was the kind of place that makes people feel safe in a way that has nothing to do with actual safety. Sandra Reyes was 52 years old, a high school biology teacher from San Antonio, Texas, who had spent 30 years teaching teenagers about the natural world, and had finally, as she told friends repeatedly in the months before this trip, decided to go see some of it for herself. Friends and colleagues described her as careful, thoughtful, and not inclined toward unnecessary risk. She had planned this trip for over a year. It was her 25th anniversary, and her husband Roberto had come along with the express intention of lying on the beach and reading historical fiction. Sandra had booked a series of reef snorkel excursions, a glass-bottom boat tour, and one scuba lesson. It was a vacation designed to be safe, relaxing, and memorable. She had read 3 books about Hawaiian marine ecosystems before departing. She had purchased her own mask, fins, and snorkel vest rather than renting because she had read that rental equipment fits poorly and that a poor fit is the leading source of discomfort for new snorkelers. She had practiced breathing through the snorkel in her bathtub. She was, in the truest sense, prepared. She had spent her first 2 days snorkeling from the beach inside the buoyed swim zone, delighted by everything she found, photographing triggerfish and parrotfish and sea turtles. On the morning of day 3, she joined a small group snorkel excursion run by a licensed operator. 8 guests, a 30-foot catamaran, a reef section approximately 1,312 feet offshore in water ranging from 15 to 20 feet deep. The guide briefed the group on the standard protocols. Stay within the designated area. Alert him if anyone felt uncomfortable. Do not touch the coral or marine life. He did not specifically address what to do if you found yourself between a resting shark and its escape route, because in 12 years of guiding, it had never come to that. The reef was exactly as beautiful as she had been promised. She spent 25 minutes moving slowly over the coral heads, watching a squadron of yellow tangs, a large Hawaiian grouper, and 2 spotted eagle rays that moved beneath her like slow, elegant kites. She was so still in the water that a juvenile Hawaiian angelfish came within 2 feet of her mask before deciding she wasn't interesting. She had been waiting 30 years for this. Every minute of it was worth the wait. She had drifted approximately 49 feet north of the main group while following a ray, the cluster signal. She lifted her head and saw the group drawing together, bodies tightening, the guide pointing toward the deeper water at the reef's edge. The tiger shark was large. Its length was 11 feet, possibly more. It was moving slowly along the reef's outer edge, unhurried, quartering back and forth in the systematic way tiger sharks patrol, covering ground the way an animal does when it is not fleeing and not chasing, but simply present. Tiger sharks possess heavily serrated teeth designed to shear through bone and dense tissue, which is why even a single investigative bite can result in catastrophic tissue loss. The guide had seen reef sharks many times. He had seen tiger sharks twice before, both times at distance, both times uneventful. He was not panicking. He was following protocol. He began moving the group toward the boat in a slow, controlled lateral arc, counting heads as they went. Sandra was at the group's outer edge. She had drifted 49 feet north following the ray. She was already swimming back toward the others when she made the error. Not a reckless error, not the error of someone who had stopped paying attention, but the invisible kind of error that happens when you are navigating by surface and something critical is happening below. She was swimming directly across the open water, between the reef edge and the boat, placing herself in the shark's patrol corridor. She did not know she had done it. There was no way to know. What happened next lasted only seconds. The tiger shark did not circle or posture. It rose from below and behind in a single, sudden movement. There was no warning, only the force of impact, as its jaws closed and released just as quickly. Tiger sharks often bite once and withdraw, and this one did exactly that, leaving a catastrophic wound before disappearing back into deeper water. The guide did not see the shark clearly. He saw the violent disturbance at the surface, and then the spreading red cloud in the clear water. Sandra remained afloat because of her snorkel vest, but the injury was immediately life-threatening. The bite had removed a substantial section of tissue from her midsection, the kind of massive trauma consistent with large tiger shark encounters. There was no practical way to control bleeding of that magnitude in open water. He reached her within seconds, securing her under the arms and pulling her toward the boat as the others scrambled aboard. She was unresponsive by the time they reached the transom. The captain was on the radio before she was fully out of the water, his voice steady in the practiced way of someone who has run emergency calls before and knows that steadiness on the radio is the only thing he can control right now. The guide began performing CPR immediately as they headed for shore. Resort medical staff met them at the waterline with a defibrillator. The air ambulance was in the air within 11 minutes of the emergency call reaching the dispatcher. Sandra was airlifted to a medical center and taken directly to theater. The surgical team worked for 2 hours. Sandra Reyes was pronounced dead at 12:14 p.m. The cause of death was listed as hemorrhagic shock, secondary to abdominal trauma from shark bite, with contributing damage to the mesenteric vasculature. She was 52 years old. Her husband was still on the beach when it happened. He had been on his 3rd chapter when a resort staff member walked toward him across the white sand with the expression people wear when they are carrying the worst news of someone's life. He was still holding his book. He told the one reporter who reached him at the airport 2 days later that Sandra had been the bravest person he had ever known, that she had died doing exactly what she had dreamed of doing, and that he was grateful and destroyed in equal measure. He did not answer any further questions. The guide took a leave of absence from the excursion company. The tiger shark was not located or removed. 6 months later, the authorities updated its guidelines to include mandatory pre-entry safety briefings covering the specific risk of drifting away from a guided group, and protocols for managing proximity to sharks along reef edges. It was May 18th, 2018. Gansby, Western Cape, South Africa. A shark cage diving vessel operating roughly 2 miles off a coastline, known internationally for great white shark activity. The water was cold and visibility was moderate. The operation was commercial, licensed, and running a scheduled excursion with paying participants. Theo Mercer was 31. He worked as a furniture restorer out of a small workshop in his hometown. He was good with his hands and comfortable in physical environments. He had done some recreational diving before, mostly shallow reef dives, where the wildlife was manageable and the stakes were low. He He had no experience with large predatory species. People who knew him described him as someone who trusted his own judgment, confident around animals, and comfortable enough in unfamiliar situations to push at the edges of them. He had planned the trip alone. He had told friends beforehand that he wanted something closer than watching from a boat. He described the dive as a chance to finally be face to face with something real. Before entry, the crew ran a full safety briefing. The rules were printed on a laminated board mounted at the entry point. They were read aloud before anyone entered the water. One rule was given more emphasis than the others. Keep all body parts inside the cage at all times. It was repeated again just before Theo entered. He acknowledged it. He went in. The cage was functioning as designed. The barrier between the participants and the actively baited water outside it was intact. Other marine life had already made several passes during the excursion. Approximately 20 minutes into the dive, a large great white approached on a slow lateral pass. It came close, within inches of the vertical bar spacing. Close enough to see clearly, close enough to fill the space in front of the cage completely. Theo released his grip on the inner bar with one hand. He moved toward the top opening of the cage and pushed his hand and forearm out through the gap above the frame into open water, reaching slightly toward the shark as it passed. He had been around smaller reef sharks before, and nothing had happened. He carried that experience into a situation where it did not apply. I just wonder what makes him think that the shark was his friend. The great white was not a reef shark. It was not indifferent to movement in its proximity. It was a large apex predator operating in actively baited water, conditioned to associate that environment with food, and responding to a new movement stimulus the way large apex predators do. The shark reacted the moment the arm entered its space. The bite was single, rapid, and severe. Its jaw closed at close to full arm extension, with a force that left no window for withdrawal. The strike caused immediate traumatic injury to the arm, severing major vessels and causing blood loss that began at a rate the crew had no means to control. Crew members at the surface moved immediately, pulling Theo back through the cage opening and onto the vessel. The extraction was complicated by the injury. He was out of the water within minutes, but the damage was already done. The wound was not survivable without immediate surgical intervention. The vessel was roughly 2 miles offshore. What was available on board was not sufficient for vascular trauma of that severity. Blood loss continued as the vessel made for shore. Emergency services had been contacted the moment he was back on deck. Theo Mercer died on board before the vessel reached the coast. He was 31 years old. Post-incident review confirmed that the safety briefing had been conducted in full, that the cage was intact and had performed as intended, and that the injury occurred entirely as a result of the arm being extended through the top opening of the cage into actively baited water. The single rule that had been emphasized and repeated before entry had not been followed. The operating company reviewed its protocols and made adjustments to the physical cage design to reduce the gap available at the top opening. No regulatory action was taken against the operator. It was July 29, 2017, and the murky waters off South Padre Island churned as thunderclouds gathered over the Texas Gulf Coast, creating conditions that brought one of the ocean's most dangerous species into the shallows. 19-year-old Micah Redden from Tulsa, Oklahoma, had never felt the ocean on his skin. Confined to a wheelchair by progressive muscular dystrophy, he retained sharp curiosity, and his parents, Darren and Lila, had planned this vacation to give him meaningful experiences while he still had sufficient strength. After 2 days building sandcastles and collecting shells, Micah begged to touch the water. It's hard not to picture how excited he must have been in that moment. Darren, an auto mechanic who had built custom modifications for Micah's wheelchair, carried him to a spot where other families played, reasoning the area would be safe, while Lila and their 11-year-old daughter Maya watched nervously. Bull sharks are a species frequently involved in near-shore attacks, with stocky builds reaching 8 to 11 feet, and capable of exerting powerful bite force sufficient to cause severe tissue and bone damage. They are adapted to hunt in shallow coastal waters and estuaries, and their territorial behavior makes them responsible for more near-shore attacks than most other shark species. Local fishing guides had reported increased baitfish activity near the shoreline all week, typically signaling larger predators moving in. Several surf fishermen observed schools of bait fish scattering in the water earlier that afternoon. The beach did not have a dedicated shark warning system, and lifeguards were primarily monitoring rip currents. Recent storms had stirred sediment, lowering visibility to less than 3 feet, which can make it more difficult to detect sharks moving through shallow water. As Darren carried Micah into the surf, the water reached roughly 4 feet deep. Micah's excitement was evident as small waves splashed against his legs and torso, sensations he had never experienced. Darren held him in a semi-floating position, supporting his arms and knees while letting the gentle surf wash over him. Unknown to the family, an approximately 8-foot bull shark had been moving through the shallows, following schools of small fish driven into the area by larger predators offshore. The shark's electroreceptors detected electrical signals and movement in the water, triggering its natural investigative behavior as it cruised through the murky surf. The attack occurred as Darren adjusted his grip. The bull shark struck from the side in the shallow water, its jaws closing on Micah's right leg. The impact knocked Darren off balance. Micah's compromised muscle control meant he could offer no resistance, as the shark's teeth caused severe tissue damage to the lower limb. The shark thrashed violently, pulling Micah partially beneath the surface before Darren regained his footing and hauled him upward. Darren desperately tried to maintain his footing and pull Micah away. I can't imagine the panic he must have felt trying to hold on to his son. The surrounding water darkened with blood as Darren struck the shark repeatedly with his fists. After several seconds, the shark released its grip and disappeared into the murky surf, leaving Micah's badly injured leg visible as Darren carried him toward shore. Darren carried his son toward shore while calling for help as blood flowed from severe wounds. Beachgoers, including a former military medic, attempted to apply pressure, but the injuries were extensive. Micah's breathing became shallow and irregular as blood loss accelerated. A lifeguard contacted emergency services. Paramedics arrived shortly after, but Micah had already gone into cardiac arrest from massive blood loss and trauma. Resuscitation continued before he was pronounced dead. The coroner's preliminary examination confirmed massive blood loss, severe vascular damage to the lower limb, and traumatic shock as the primary causes of death. The beach remained open, with temporary shark awareness signs and increased lifeguard patrols for the weekend. The Redden family returned home 3 days later, while local coverage focused on the rarity of shark attacks rather than the specific circumstances. 6 months later, disability advocates helped install a wheelchair-accessible beach ramp near the site, creating a small memorial honoring Micah's desire to experience the ocean despite his physical limitations. The incident highlighted the particular vulnerability of disabled individuals in marine environments, prompting updated safety protocols at several Texas beaches regarding assisted swimming and accessibility. From all accounts, Micah had done nothing to provoke the encounter, and the tragedy underscores how even careful planning cannot eliminate the inherent risks of engaging with nature. His brief experience in the surf remains a testament to his family's determination to create meaningful moments, blending joy with unavoidable danger. It was October 12th, 2023, and by late morning, the stretch of sand had emptied out to almost nothing. A few tire tracks from an early surf check, a crushed aluminum can near the dune grass, and the steady movement of low gray swells under an overcast sky. Darlene Osueke, 61, had worked the serving line at a public school district for over 2 decades. She was known for remembering which students needed extra portions without being told, and for staying a few minutes late to clean equipment others left behind. That detail stopped me cold. The kind of person who does that quietly, without recognition, that matters. The work was repetitive and physically demanding, and over time it had taken a toll on her joints. By 2021, she had undergone a partial knee replacement that did not fully restore mobility. She continued to experience swelling in her left leg and reduced stability on uneven ground, with body weight and post-surgical limitations further affecting balance and endurance. Medical records indicated a body weight of approximately 344 pounds, which, combined with post-surgical limitations, affected balance, endurance, and movement in unstable surf conditions. Her doctor recommended low-impact activity to support circulation and edema management, such as pool exercise. Instead, she continued her routine of returning each October to a quiet stretch of coastline where she would sit, rest, and wade slowly into the water without swimming. That morning, water temperature was in the low 70s, with limited visibility due to runoff from a nearby tidal system, creating a murky near-shore environment. In such coastal conditions, large sharks, like bull sharks, may occasionally move through while following natural prey patterns, though encounters with humans remain rare and generally unpredictable. A small family that had been in the water earlier eventually left, and the beach grew quiet. A jogger passed along the shoreline, noting Darlene standing waist-deep in the water before continuing on. Before entering, she had removed her sandals and a compression sleeve from her left calf, which had been managing a minor chronic wound. In surf zone conditions, minor injuries are not considered a reliable attractant for marine predators. Movement and environmental disturbance are far more significant factors. Darlene moved gradually farther out, reaching chest depth. She walked parallel to shore, with slow, controlled steps, using water buoyancy to reduce joint strain, though wave motion and uneven footing reduced stability. A large shark made brief contact with her lower left leg in a single bite and release event, followed by additional close-range contact in the same area, resulting in a more forceful injury to the same limb. The animal remained in the immediate vicinity briefly, then moved away. Within a short interval, additional contact occurred in close proximity, producing a more forceful injury to the same limb, resulting in near-complete traumatic amputation of the left lower extremity, with major vascular disruption and uncontrolled hemorrhage. Believe me, I've covered a lot of these cases. The clinical language in the reports never makes it easier to process what it actually describes. Darlene struggled to maintain balance in the water as blood loss and instability progressed, making controlled movement toward shore increasingly difficult. The disturbance was noticed by the jogger, who had turned back along the shoreline. What initially appeared as irregular splashing became a distress situation as he approached. No further marine contact occurred as she reached progressively shallower water, and the animal was not observed again. By the time assistance reached her, she was near the shoreline. She was pulled onto wet sand, where bystanders applied direct pressure and improvised a tourniquet using available clothing while emergency services were contacted. First responders arrived shortly after dispatch and initiated hemorrhage control and stabilization on scene. Following assessment of injury severity, air evacuation was requested for transport to a regional trauma center for definitive care. Medical documentation later described severe traumatic injury to the left lower extremity, consistent with near-complete traumatic amputation and extensive vascular and soft tissue destruction, with suspected involvement of major lower limb arteries. Despite rapid intervention, she was pronounced deceased later that day due to exsanguination. March 4th, 2019. The surface of the Outer Reef Channel was glassy at first light, the kind of flat calm that exists in tropical water only in the brief window between darkness and the morning wind. The sky was clear and pale at the horizon. Beneath the surface, the reef wall dropped away steeply into open blue that lost its color well before it found the bottom. Nathan Cole was 38. He had been freediving for 11 years and instructing for 6. And he had logged a volume of open water dives that most people who dive recreationally do not accumulate in a lifetime. He was strong in the water, deliberate in his technique, and had spent years building a systematic understanding of his own limits by pushing against them incrementally and recording the results. His colleagues described him as methodical. His clients described him as calm. Both of those things were accurate, and neither of them was sufficient that morning. He arrived at the site with 4 others on a small vessel. The plan was to conduct freediving sessions along the reef wall during the early hours before the current strengthened. Before the group had assembled and entered the water together, Nathan went in alone. He told one of the crew he was going for a warm-up along the wall. He descended. And in open water, being alone changes the meaning of every decision you make. Tiger sharks do not hunt the way most people imagine sharks hunt. They do not accelerate from depth and commit to a target without assessment. They approach, withdraw, circle wide, and approach again. There is something uniquely unsettling about a shark that does not rush. The investigation is extended and unhurried, conducted with a patience that an animal completely at home in open water can sustain for as long as the target remains available. The shark made its first pass below Nathan during one of his descents, coming in from the open water side of the wall at an oblique angle. He registered it, aborted the dive, and ascended. He held at the surface for several minutes. This is the moment where the story could still have ended differently. The shark had withdrawn. The water below him showed nothing. He descended again. The shark returned on the second approach from the same general direction, shallower this time, and faster in its final committed movement toward him. The strike came during his ascent at the torso. The force of it drove him sideways in the water column. He did not reach the surface on his own. The crew entered the water when he did not return. They found him at shallow depth and brought him up. By the time they had him on the vessel, he was unresponsive. They ran for shore. It was not enough. Nathan Cole was 38 years old. He was buried by his family the following week. The investigation confirmed he had entered the water without the group's knowledge, diving alone without a surface observer. The tiger shark had completed at least one full investigative pass before the strike. Nathan had registered that pass clearly enough to abort the dive and return to the surface. He held there for several minutes while the water below him appeared clear. I think that is what makes this account difficult to forget. Not the attack itself, but the fact that he recognized the warning before it happened. Then he went back down. That is the detail I have not been able to move past since I first read this account. He had the information. The water had given it to him plainly enough that he responded to it the first time, came up, and waited. The second descent was made in full possession of that knowledge. He went back down anyway, and the shark was still there. I am not going to speculate about what passed through his reasoning in those minutes at the surface, but the sequence of it, the first pass, the ascent, the wait, and then the decision to descend again, is the part of this story that I think about the most. On May 21st, 2014, the clear tropical waters of Belize shimmered under the afternoon sun, concealing bull sharks resting in the sand channels and reef shadows of the shallow flats. The reef flats extended several hundred yards offshore, with water depths ranging from ankle deep to about 4 feet. Ideal conditions for sharks to move through largely unseen. Ronan Vale, 34, a highway construction foreman from Boise, Idaho, had never snorkeled before, arriving in Belize 5 days earlier, with co-workers Dale Hoffman and Cypher Alonso. After 8 months of grueling 12-hour shifts, supervising interstate construction, this vacation, funded by overtime, was his first extended break in over 2 years. Honestly, I feel for him. Anyone would be excited for a rare escape like this. With limited experience in water activities and only basic snorkeling instruction from the resort, he approached the ocean cautiously, while his companions were equally unaware of potential hazards. The resort provided basic snorkeling instruction focused on equipment use and water safety. No formal marine life briefings were given to independent snorkelers, and signage indicating shark activity was limited to guided tour groups. Bull sharks are active hunters, capable of operating in extremely shallow water. They do not rest motionless on the seabed the way some species do. They cruise slowly through channels and reef edges, responding quickly to nearby movement or disturbance. That morning, staff had observed unusually high shark activity due to seasonal feeding, but warnings were shared only with guided tour groups. Local fishing guides noted large sharks moving through sand channels, indicating active feeding conditions. Yet casual snorkelers remained unaware, assuming the placid waters were harmless. Ronan and his companions decided to explore a sandy channel roughly 300 yards from shore, where the receding tide had created water about 4 feet deep. The clear water revealed starfish and small rays on the white sand, but none of the men noticed a nearly 9-foot bull shark cruising slowly through the channel ahead of them. As Ronan stepped backward, joking with his friends about sunburns, he moved directly into the shark's path. The bull shark reacted instantly, clamping its jaws around his right calf. The teeth punctured skin and muscle, holding fast with the species' characteristic bite strength. Personally, this part gives me chills. Just a tiny misstep, triggering something catastrophic. Ronan screamed as Dale grabbed him under the arms, and Cypher tried to push the shark away with a fin, but the animal's jaw muscles resisted. The shark thrashed for several seconds before releasing and retreating into the channel. The water around them quickly clouded with blood, alerting nearby snorkelers and resort staff. After roughly 10 seconds, consistent with documented bull shark attack durations, the shark released Ronan and retreated. He collapsed into the shallow water, his leg badly injured and bleeding heavily from multiple puncture wounds. Dale and Cypher carried him toward shore, applying pressure to the most severe bleeding site, while a resort employee ran to contact emergency services. The nearest medical facility was on the mainland, requiring paramedics to traverse several miles of open water by boat. Despite immediate departure, the team did not arrive for roughly 30 minutes, by which point Ronan had lost consciousness from massive blood loss. Resuscitation efforts continued during transport and at the clinic, but multiple arterial punctures proved fatal. He was pronounced dead from exsanguination secondary to penetrating trauma, leaving friends and family stunned by the suddenness of the attack. In the aftermath, the resort implemented mandatory briefings for all guests engaging in water activities, including clear instructions about bull shark behavior and other marine hazards. Local tourism authorities quietly issued advisories to nearby resorts, highlighting the risks of unsupervised snorkeling in shallow reef areas, though distribution remained limited to avoid deterring diving tourism. Ronan's employer established a memorial fund for marine safety education, while Dale and Cypher required extensive counseling to cope with the trauma of witnessing the attack. It really hits me how one incident can ripple far beyond the victim, affecting everyone around them. The incident underscored the dangers of casual interaction with marine life in shallow reef environments, where predators can remain hidden despite seemingly calm conditions. It also highlighted the importance of clear, accessible safety communication for inexperienced tourists.
September 22, 2015, brought unusual conditions to Bodega Bay, California. Heavy rains from the previous week had created significant runoff, reducing underwater visibility to a dangerous 3 feet and bringing nutrients that attracted massive schools of bait fish. The water temperature had risen to an unusual 64 degrees Fahrenheit due to El Niño conditions. Carlos Mendoza, 38, had seen worse conditions in his 12 years of commercial sea urchin diving, but something felt different about this day. Carlos was the kind of diver other professionals respected, methodical, experienced, and never one to take unnecessary risks. His weathered hands and sun-darkened skin told the story of over 2,000 commercial dives along the Northern California coast. He worked exclusively with his brother as a dive tender, and their operation was known for its safety record. The recent El Niño weather pattern had created unusual conditions throughout the Pacific coast, bringing warmer water temperatures and altered current patterns that disrupted normal marine ecosystems. These conditions had attracted an unexpected visitor to the shallow waters of Bodega Bay, a predator that typically remained in deeper offshore waters. Blue sharks are among the most wide-ranging and aggressive predators in the world's oceans. These sleek, fast-moving sharks typically inhabit open ocean environments, but are known to venture into coastal waters when following prey or unusual current patterns. Growing up to 12 feet in length and weighing up to 400 pounds, blue sharks are built for speed and endurance. What makes blue sharks particularly dangerous is their opportunistic and aggressive nature. Unlike many shark species that are cautious around unfamiliar objects, blue sharks are bold investigators that will attack almost anything that moves. That afternoon, Carlos was completing his final dive of the day, working at 45 feet depth to harvest red sea urchins from the rocky bottom near the Russian River mouth. The recent storms had stirred up the bottom sediment, creating murky conditions that reduced visibility to almost zero. Following strict commercial diving protocols, he began his ascent at 1:30 p.m., stopping at 15 feet for his mandatory 3-minute safety stop. The 10-foot blue shark had been patrolling these waters for several days, following the unusual warm water intrusion that had brought it far from its normal open ocean habitat. The murky conditions didn't hinder this predator, which relied heavily on its other senses to locate prey. The shark had been feeding on the abundant bait fish in the area, but the presence of a large moving object in its territory triggered its investigative response. As Carlos reached for his surface marker buoy during his safety stop, the movement attracted the blue shark's attention through the murky water. The shark's lateral line system detected the water displacement, while its ampullae of Lorenzini sensed the electrical field generated by his beating heart. Carlos caught a glimpse of movement in his peripheral vision, but couldn't identify the source in the murky conditions. The attack came suddenly and with devastating force. The blue shark grabbed Carlos's right leg just above the knee, its powerful jaws clamping down with 1,000 pounds per square inch of pressure. The sharp, triangular teeth sliced through his wetsuit and deep into muscle and bone. Blue sharks are known for their tenacious grip and thrashing behavior, designed to subdue large prey in the open ocean. Carlos immediately activated his emergency whistle and fought back with his urchin rake, striking at the shark's head and snout. But blue sharks are persistent attackers that rarely retreat once they commit to an assault. The thrashing continued for nearly 90 seconds as the shark attempted to subdue its prey. The shark's serrated teeth sawed through Carlos's femoral artery, sending clouds of blood into the murky water. The scent of blood triggered an even more aggressive response from the blue shark, which began to roll and twist in an attempt to tear away larger pieces of flesh. Carlos managed to drive his dive knife deep into the shark's gill area, finally forcing it to release its grip and retreat into the murky water. His brother heard the emergency whistle from the boat 100 yards away and immediately raced toward Carlos's dive flag, covering the distance in 90 seconds. Despite his brother's desperate efforts to control the bleeding and race toward shore at maximum speed, Carlos died from hemorrhagic shock during the 8-minute boat ride to the harbor.
It was August 18th, 2016. Neptune Islands, South Australia. A shark cage diving vessel running a scheduled excursion at one of the most active great white shark sites in the world. The session was approaching its final rotation of the day. A large female great white, estimated at approximately 5 meters, had been present throughout the session, making increasingly close passes around the cage and the retrieval equipment along the side of the vessel. Danny Mercer was 45. He had worked as a senior deckhand on the same vessel for 11 years. His role was on deck, managing equipment, operating the cage retrieval system, and keeping the session running. He knew the procedures well enough to have contributed to writing portions of them. 11 years of working around great white sharks without serious incident had normalized the risk in ways that were not visible until August 18th. I can't move past this detail. 11 years without consequence is not proof that the risk was manageable. What happened next proved that. The marine biologist on board had been logging behavioral changes throughout the session. The animal's circling pattern had tightened over the course of the afternoon. Passes were coming closer to the cage and closer to the hull on each loop. The captain had indicated they were running the final rotation before pulling the cage. The decision to wrap up was partly a response to the observed behavior. During the final rotation, the retrieval cable began sticking. It was a recurring minor mechanical issue on the equipment. Standard protocol during active shark presence required crew to maintain distance from the water edge and avoid manual intervention until conditions were clear. Danny leaned over the side of the vessel and reached down to manually guide the cable. He had performed the same action on previous occasions without incident. The shark had been moving in the direction of the cable for several minutes. Danny remained in position and continued working it by hand. The female made a close pass along the hull toward the retrieval cable. The cable movement at the waterline created a direct stimulus below Danny's position. He was leaning over the railing with his forearm near the water when the shark came up. The bite was a single upward strike, catching the forearm at the waterline. Crew members pulled him back onto the deck within seconds. He was clear of the water almost immediately, but the injury was already beyond what could be addressed on board. The strike had torn through major vascular structures in the forearm. Crew applied pressure and used what first aid was available, but blood loss could not be controlled at that level. Emergency services were contacted and the vessel turned for shore. Danny Mercer died on board before reaching land. He was 45 years old. Post-incident review confirmed that Danny had manually intervened with the retrieval cable during active shark presence in direct deviation from the established protocol he had helped draft. Investigators noted that the tightening passes had been identified and communicated before the incident, and that his decision to remain in position reflected a pattern of risk normalization built up over years without consequence. The operating company revised its deck handling procedures and required a full pause in manual operations during any period of heightened shark activity near the hull, with a designated crew member assigned to enforce the boundary. No regulatory action was taken against the operator. On October 8, 2013, the calm pre-dawn waters off Mossel Bay concealed great white sharks patrolling near a sandbar that extended 150 yards from shore, where converging currents attracted seals and other prey. Calder Nix, 42, had begun kayak fishing 2 years earlier during a difficult divorce, using it to find solitude before his warehouse shifts. A Mossel Bay native, he purchased a basic sight-on-top kayak after his ex-wife retained their powerboat. His simple tackle setup suited his methodical approach and provided routine and independence during otherwise isolating circumstances. I get the feeling he treasured these quiet mornings alone more than anyone could know. Calder's approach to fishing was conservative. He typically stayed within 100 yards of shore, targeting smaller species such as yellowtail and bonito, avoiding excursions into deeper water that posed greater risk. His co-workers at the warehouse considered him reliable, but increasingly solitary, someone who preferred sharing observations from his weekend fishing outings rather than participating in broader social activities. The waters around Mossel Bay are a known hunting ground for great white sharks, with adults reaching 15 to 20 feet in length. These sharks are capable of breaching the surface with significant vertical speed, delivering impact forces sufficient to incapacitate seals and other large prey. Local shark monitoring groups issued informal alerts to anglers via word of mouth and online fishing forums, though official warnings were limited. Calder noticed higher than usual numbers of seabirds diving in deeper water that morning, usually indicating baitfish activity driven by predators, but he interpreted it as normal feeding behavior. Calder paddled his yellow kayak toward a preferred fishing spot over the sandbar, where the water measured roughly 4 feet deep. He positioned himself approximately 40 yards from shore and prepared his tackle, using fresh sardines and pilchards purchased the previous evening. Unbeknownst to him, a great white shark of roughly 14 feet had been patrolling the deeper channel adjacent to the sandbar since before dawn. The shark's electroreceptors detected the unusual electrical signals from the kayak and occupant, while its acute sense of smell registered the bait's scent dispersing in the water. The silhouette of the kayak and Calder's movements created visual cues similar to injured seals, the shark's typical prey in these waters. While concentrating on reeling in a hooked bonito near the edge of the sandbar, Calder remained unaware of the predator approaching from the deeper channel. The shark accelerated, using the cover of the deeper water to close the distance before breaching the surface. Its strike came directly from below, delivering a sudden impact that severely dented the kayak and knocked Calder into the water. His fishing gear, including tackle boxes, rods, and bait, was scattered across the surface, further complicating his ability to stabilize himself or respond. Before he could regain orientation or attempt to swim toward the partially submerged kayak, the shark's jaws closed on his upper torso. The upper teeth penetrated the area between his shoulder blades, while the lower teeth gripped his chest and abdomen, creating puncture wounds that immediately compromised both lung function and circulation. The force of the bite fractured multiple ribs and compressed internal organs, including the heart and lungs, while severing major blood vessels. The shark engaged in brief head-shaking behavior before releasing, a predatory response consistent with great white attacks on large prey. These movements worsened the trauma to Calder's already damaged internal organs and skeletal structure, accelerating blood loss. Calder's body went limp almost immediately, as spinal injury, severe internal trauma, and hemorrhaging made voluntary movement impossible, leaving him incapacitated in the water. The water around the site quickly discolored as the shark retreated into deeper water, leaving the damaged kayak and scattered tackle behind. You can almost hear the silence that follows, a stark contrast to the chaos just moments before. Rescue boats from local marine emergency services arrived within 14 minutes of the call. Surface searches recovered only broken kayak pieces and scattered tackle. Underwater searches later found Calder's body, with injuries consistent with predatory shark attacks. The coroner classified the death as a predatory shark attack, noting that the injuries, including multiple punctures to the torso, fractured ribs, and massive internal trauma, were instantly fatal. Authorities temporarily closed the sandbar area for 48 hours to conduct patrols and assess risk, though no further shark sightings occurred. The incident was reported in regional fishing publications, focusing on the risks associated with solo kayak anglers rather than specific details of the attack. In the aftermath, local authorities emphasized safety procedures for early morning fishing and water activities in areas known for shark presence. Informal advisories were circulated to other anglers and tour operators regarding the risks of unsupervised activity near deep channels and sandbars. September 2nd, 2018. Several days of continuous rain had fallen across the region before that night, and the water moving through the brackish tidal channels along the coastline carried the dark, turbid quality that follows prolonged runoff. The surface had the color and opacity of strong tea. Beneath it, visibility was effectively zero, and this is the part where the conditions quietly begin stacking on top of each other. Marcus Lee was 27. He had grown up near that coastline and had worked on the water in various capacities since his mid-teens. He knew those channels at different tides, in different seasons, and had spent enough time moving along them to have developed an intuitive relationship with the environment. It was not a place he felt uneasy. It was familiar ground, or familiar water, which may be the same thing when you have been moving through it long enough. I think familiarity with a place can become its own kind of blindfold after enough years. The task that night was straightforward. The anchor rope on his small fishing boat had tangled somewhere beneath the hull, and it needed to be freed before the boat could be moved. He stepped in from the dock. The water reached his waist. The surface reflected the dock light above him, but showed nothing below it, which in that water would have been true at any depth. Freeing the rope required him to work with his hands near the hull, pull against the tension of the tangle, kick and reposition to find the right angle. It was the kind of task you complete by feel rather than sight, and it required him to move through the water continuously for several minutes. What makes incidents like this difficult is that nothing about his behavior would have looked unusual to the people watching from the dock. Baitfish had been accumulating against the pilings in the hours before Marcus entered the water. Some of them had been injured in the process of being pushed against the structure by current and by predators moving through the channel. Bull sharks commonly enter brackish coastal systems during and after heavy rainfall, following baitfish concentrations into water that would seem too shallow and too murky for an ocean predator. They do not navigate by sight in those conditions. In water like that, the shark is not seeing a person, it is interpreting movement. They navigate by pressure change, by low-frequency vibration, by the specific pattern of movement that distinguishes injured prey from background water noise. The pattern Marcus was generating as he worked, the kicking, the irregular movement, the pulling against resistance near the hull, was not distinguishable from that signal. Not because he was doing anything wrong, simply because he was a person in the water, in the dark, producing the same frequencies as struggling prey. The bite was immediate and single. The shark contacted his leg, delivered a high-force bite, and released. Then it was gone. That is the behavior. Most of these interactions are single contacts, followed by immediate withdrawal. The animal does not pursue. It bites once, releases when it registers something other than what it expected, and moves away. I think the single bite nature of these encounters is what unsettles people the most. One mistake in identification is enough. The people with Marcus on the dock saw him come back toward the surface and initially believed he had struck the propeller housing. It was not until the blood began spreading across the water under the dock light and Marcus collapsed that the nature of what had happened became clear. Marcus Lee was pronounced dead at the scene. He was 27 years old. The cause of death was catastrophic arterial damage from a single shark bite. The conditions that night were not unusual. After heavy rain, in a tidal channel with a dock light running and baitfish concentrated at the pilings, that water was exactly the kind of environment that produces these encounters. None of the individual factors were out of the ordinary. Together, at that hour, they created something that Marcus had no reason to anticipate. His family buried him that week. The rope was still tangled under the hull when they came to collect the boat.
August 17th, 2017, brought perfect conditions to the waters 25 miles off Marathon in the Florida Keys. The Gulf Stream current ran clear and blue, with visibility extending over 100 feet into the crystal clear depths. The water temperature held steady at a comfortable 82 degrees Fahrenheit. Alexandra Alex Petrov, 31, had been looking forward to this deep training session for weeks. Alex was a legend in the freediving community, a world-ranked athlete who could dive to depths exceeding 200 feet on a single breath. Her lean, athletic build and intense focus had earned her multiple national records and the respect of freedivers worldwide. She had been teaching freediving for 8 years, running a successful school in Key Largo, where she trained hundreds of students. The waters off the Florida Keys represented some of the most challenging and rewarding freediving locations in the world. The proximity to the Gulf Stream brought clear, warm water and an abundance of pelagic species, but it also attracted some of the ocean's most dangerous predators. At 4:20 p.m., Alex was demonstrating deep, constant weight technique for an advanced student, preparing to descend to 180 feet. During her extended bottom time at 180 feet, Alex experienced shallow water blackout during her ascent, a condition where decreased oxygen levels cause unconsciousness as a freediver approaches the surface. When she finally broke the surface, gasping for air after the deep dive, she found herself 400 yards from her safety boat in unfamiliar water. What Alex didn't know was that she had surfaced directly in a feeding zone where a dead pilot whale calf had been floating for 2 days. The decomposing carcass had created a massive scent trail that attracted scavengers from miles around, including some of the ocean's most dangerous predators. Tiger sharks are among the most dangerous predators in tropical and subtropical waters worldwide. These massive sharks can grow up to 18 feet in length and weigh over 1,400 pounds, making them one of the largest predatory sharks in the ocean. Their distinctive dark stripes, which give them their name, fade as they mature, but their reputation as indiscriminate killers only grows stronger with age. What makes tiger sharks particularly terrifying is their feeding behavior. They are often called the waste baskets of the sea because they will eat virtually anything they encounter. Their stomachs have been found to contain everything from sea turtles and seals to license plates, tires, and even human remains. This indiscriminate feeding behavior, combined with their massive size and powerful jaws, makes them extremely dangerous to humans. Tiger sharks possess incredibly powerful jaws, capable of delivering up to 1,050 pounds per square inch of crushing force. Their teeth are uniquely designed with a curved, serrated edge that can cut through the shells of sea turtles, the tough skin of other sharks, and even metal objects. A 14-foot female tiger shark had been feeding aggressively on the whale carcass and was in a heightened predatory state. The massive predator, weighing approximately 1,200 pounds, had been gorging herself on the rich blubber and meat of the dead whale. When feeding on large carcasses, tiger sharks often become more aggressive and territorial, defending their food source against any perceived threats. Alex's rapid breathing and surface splashing after the deep dive attracted the shark's attention immediately. To the predator, the surface disturbance looked like a wounded or distressed animal, exactly the type of easy prey that tiger sharks are programmed to attack. The shark's lateral line system detected the water movements caused by Alex's breathing and arm movements, while her elevated heart rate after the deep dive created electrical signals that the shark could detect from a considerable distance. The massive predator approached from below, using the sun's glare on the surface to mask its approach until the final moment. Alex, still recovering from her deep dive and disoriented from the shallow water blackout, never saw the attack coming. The shark approached from below and grabbed Alex's torso in a single, devastating bite that showcased the full power of one of the ocean's most formidable predators. Massive jaws, capable of opening to a gape of nearly 2 feet, engulfed her midsection with crushing force. The serrated teeth sliced through her wetsuit and deep into her torso, crushing ribs and puncturing vital organs. The attack lasted approximately 30 seconds, but the damage was catastrophic. Tiger sharks are known for their powerful bite and thrashing behavior, using their muscular necks to cause maximum trauma to their prey. The shark's grip crushed Alex's ribcage and caused massive internal bleeding before it released her and disappeared into the depths. Her safety diver, searching frantically from the boat after losing sight of Alex during her ascent, heard her brief scream and located her within 3 minutes, but the damage had already been done. The shark's powerful jaws had crushed Alex's ribcage and punctured her lungs, liver, and other vital organs. Massive internal bleeding had already begun, and her body was going into shock from the trauma. Alex was pulled from the water and given immediate medical attention, but the damage was too severe. She died from massive internal trauma and blood loss before reaching shore. Her world-class athletic career ended by one of the ocean's most unpredictable predators. Investigation revealed that the whale carcass had created a feeding aggregation of multiple tiger sharks in the area, critical information that hadn't been communicated to local dive operators. The incident led to new protocols requiring marine wildlife surveys before deep diving operations.
It was September 3rd, 2015. Neptune Island's South Australia. A shark cage diving vessel running a scheduled excursion at one of the most established great white shark dive sites in the world. A research team was on board that day, observing and documenting the behavior of a large female great white estimated at approximately 17 feet. The animal had been present since the session began. Vincent Cole was 39. He ran an adventure travel blog and had built a following around experiences that most people would not attempt. Shark cage diving was not new to him. He had completed 47 prior cage dives across multiple locations and considered himself well beyond the level of a standard participant. He was familiar with procedures, familiar with how sharks moved around cages, and had developed what he believed was a reliable ability to read their behavior from inside. That confidence was not unfounded in a general sense. It was misapplied on September 3rd. Before entry, the crew ran the standard safety briefing. The rules were clear. Stay inside the cage. Follow crew instructions immediately and without question. If a recall is issued, exit without delay. Vincent had heard versions of this briefing 47 times before he entered the cage. The female great white had been circling the cage since early in the session. The research team on board was documenting her behavior, and what they observed was not typical. Her circling pattern was tighter than normal. She was making repeated close passes with a consistency that suggested heightened interest rather than routine investigation. Visible jaw movement was noted during several of the passes. The researchers flagged the behavior to the crew. The crew issued a recall. All divers were instructed to exit the cage immediately. The other participants began moving toward the exit. Vincent stayed where he was. The crew repeated the instruction. He told them they were overreacting. He said he had more experience than anyone else in the water and that he could read the shark. He said the animal was not a threat. While the other divers cleared the cage, he remained at his position and leaned forward toward the bars rather than moving back toward the exit. He removed one hand from the internal grip bar. His body shifted toward the door seam where the cage opening was widest. This part still bothers me. The crew said it twice. Vincent Cole, 47 dives deep, told all of them to relax. The female great white came through on another close pass while he was in that position. Vincent lost his footing on the cage floor. As he stumbled forward, his arm slipped through the gap at the door seam, crossing the cage boundary into open water at the moment the shark completed her pass at close range. The animal reacted without hesitation. The bite closed on the exposed forearm. She followed it immediately with a forceful lateral shake. The motion wrenched the arm hard against the doorframe before the crew could reach him. The radial and ulnar arteries were torn. The injury was catastrophic from the first moment of contact. Blood loss was immediate and severe. Crew members on the vessel pulled him from above the waterline, hauling the cage line and reaching down from the deck. Vincent was on the deck within minutes, but the damage could not be reversed with what was available on board. Emergency response was initiated, and the vessel turned for shore. Vincent Cole died on board before reaching land. He was 39 years old. Post-incident review confirmed that he had refused a direct recall instruction, repeated across approximately 90 seconds, that his positioning at the cage door seam was inconsistent with proper protocol, and that the other participants had exited without incident. The operating company introduced physical confirmation steps requiring crew sign-off before any participant could remain in the cage during a recall. 47 dives. A recall he ignored twice. Every other participant was already clear. He was the only one still in the water. October 7th, 2020. Overcast. A low, even swell rolling across the open water well beyond the continental shelf. The wind was light enough to leave a readable surface between the swells. Conditions that experienced offshore fishermen recognize as productive, the kind of day that pulls people who know that water out past the horizon before most people have finished their morning. David Harlan was 52. He had been fishing offshore water since his mid-20s, starting on larger charter vessels and working his way toward his own boat over the years, a compact but capable vessel he had bought and steadily modified for the kind of deep trolling he preferred. He knew the equipment, he knew the water, and he had worked large fish alongside his hull many times. He was not a person who made careless decisions on the water. He was a person who had performed the same sequences so many times that the risks embedded in them had grown invisible through repetition. That distinction matters. I think repetition changes the way people perceive danger more than confidence does. He was offshore that morning with one companion. They had trolling lines running in open water when one of them ran hard and far in a direction that removed any doubt about the size of what was on the other end. The fish ran for a considerable distance before the drag brought it gradually toward the surface. By the time it appeared alongside the hull, it was a large shortfin mako, a species routinely documented among the most volatile and physically capable sharks encountered in open ocean sport fishing. The fish had fought hard. It was near the surface, rolling slightly, its movements reduced to something that read as exhaustion. Shortfin makos are among the fastest animals in the ocean. They are capable of direction changes and full acceleration from a near standstill with a speed that has no correspondence to the stillness they display when oxygen depleted at the surface. The fatigue is real. The reduced movement alongside the hull is a genuine physiological state. It is also temporary, and it coexists with the animal's full physical capability. David made the decision not to cut the line. The hook was set in a position he believed he could reach and remove with the fish still in the water alongside the hull. He had done comparable things before with smaller animals, and the logic he applied to those situations he carried forward into this one without adjustment for the difference in scale. He took the leader in one hand, leaned across the gunnel, and reached toward the animal's jaw with the other. The mako accelerated from the surface in a single motion, clearing the waterline partially and driving into David's upper arm and shoulder before its own weight pulled it back into the water. The contact lasted under a second. The structural damage it produced in that second was severe. The force of it pulled him over the gunnel and into the water alongside the hull. His companion threw a line immediately and was in the water after him within seconds. David was unresponsive by the time he reached him. They were brought aboard together. The companion ran the vessel in at full throttle. It was not enough. David Harlan was 52 years old. He was buried by his family shortly after. The investigation confirmed that a cutting tool capable of removing the leader cleanly at a safe distance from the animal was present on the vessel and within arm's reach of where David was standing when he leaned over the gunnel. I have read several accounts of mako encounters alongside fishing vessels before finding this one. The consistent thread through all of them is the same. The fish appears spent. The fish appears still. The person involved understands the animal is dangerous and makes a judgment in that specific moment that the risk is contained. And then the moment changes faster than the judgment can update. It was June 14th, 2015, on a rented stretch of private beach outside Nassau, New Providence Island, the Bahamas, and the wedding was still in motion when something in the water changed the tone of everything happening on shore. Crispin Aldemar Voss, 31, was an HVAC technician from Asheville, North Carolina. He worked steadily, avoided attention, and followed routines. The destination wedding had been Britta's vision, and he had agreed without resistance. Britta Celine Haverkamp, 29, a dental hygienist, had spent nearly 2 years organizing the event. The photographer, Tomasz Wirecki, a Miami-based freelancer, suggested a final photo set in shallow water at sunset for lighting conditions. The resort allowed beach access without restriction. From the research I did, this kind of unrestricted shoreline access at resort properties in the Bahamas is pretty standard, and that context matters for what unfolds here. The shoreline was part of a managed coastal cove with clear, shallow water that gradually deepened into sand channels. This region is part of a wider Bahamian marine ecosystem, where coastal shark species occasionally move through reef edges, sand flats, and nearshore feeding areas while following prey movement patterns. The water was calm at the surface, with only light wave action breaking over the sandbar. Visibility was moderate, but reduced near the bottom due to stirred sediment from earlier movement in the shallows. Several guests were still waiting nearby, adding minor surface disturbance, while the couple remained stationary for photos as the photographer adjusted position closer to the waterline. Crispin stepped into chest-deep water. Britta followed, her dress floating in the current. Guests watched from the shoreline as the final poses were set. The incident occurred suddenly. Crispin's body shifted as an unseen force from below disrupted his balance and pulled him partially underwater. The movement was abrupt enough that nearby guests initially interpreted it as a slip or loss of footing in uneven sand. He resurfaced disoriented, displacing water and struggling to orient himself before attempting to regain balance. A shark was briefly observed in close proximity in shallow water. based on regional species presence and post-incident marine review. The most likely species involved was a bull shark, a coastal species documented in Bahamian nearshore environments and associated with severe bite incidents in shallow surf zones. Species identification could not be confirmed at the time of the incident. The interaction was consistent with a short bite and release event, a behavior documented in some coastal shark species where unfamiliar surface activity or rapid movement can trigger investigative contact rather than sustained predation. Immediately after the first contact, Crispin attempted to move toward shore but lost structural stability in the water due to injury, wave motion, and uneven footing within the sand channel. The resulting splashing and irregular movement were followed within seconds by additional close-range contact to the same lower limb, producing a more forceful injury and rapid escalation of tissue and vascular damage. Crispin remained conscious as Britta reached him. Several guests entered the water to assist, while others called for emergency help. The photographer moved toward shore as the situation escalated. Crispin was brought into shallower water by bystanders. He remained conscious for a short period, but showed rapid signs of severe blood loss from the lower body. His ability to stand collapsed as hemorrhage progressed. Britta was right there. I keep coming back to that. She was right there, and there was nothing she could do to change what was already happening. Emergency services arrived shortly after dispatch and performed hemorrhage control on scene, including a tourniquet, before rapid transport. He was airlifted to a hospital in Nassau for surgery, but died later that day from exsanguination due to severe lower limb vascular injury. Authorities classified it as a fatal marine injury during recreational shoreline activity. With no direct visual confirmation or recovered animal, the exact sequence and species could not be confirmed, though regional reviews suggested a likely interaction with a coastal bull shark. Limited footage briefly circulated before removal. The resort conducted an internal review and issued no public findings beyond standard reporting. Britta returned home days later, and the photographer left wedding work. No further statements were made. It was June 14th, 2017. Elphinstone Reef, Egyptian Red Sea. An open water shark dive operating at a remote offshore site known for reliable encounters with the oceanic white-tip shark. The dive was conducted under direct supervision, with guides in the water. Multiple sharks were present from the start of the session. One large oceanic white-tip, estimated at around 9 to 10 feet, had been circling at a distance since the group entered. The water. Blaine Carter was 28. He ran a social media page built around close wildlife footage and had around 6,000 followers. Every trip he took was content. Every dive was an opportunity to come back with something that would perform well and grow the page. He had paid approximately $4,000 for this dive and had told his followers before leaving that he would return with clear shark footage. The helmet-mounted GoPro he wore into the water was not just equipment, it was the whole point of being there. Before entry, the dive guides ran a full briefing. The rules were specific to the environment. Maintain a stable position. Do not reach toward sharks or any objects in the water. Do not pursue drifting equipment. Keep all movements controlled and deliberate. Oceanic whitetips were described during the briefing as slow-moving animals capable of sudden acceleration and highly responsive to erratic or uncontrolled movement in open water. Blaine heard the briefing and entered the water. The first portion of the dive went without incident. The sharks were present and moving at distance. Blaine was recording. The large white tip continued its wide circle around the group. Nothing happened that was outside the expected parameters of the dive. At some point during the session, the mount holding the GoPro to Blaine's helmet failed. The mount had not been secured with a secondary tether, and when the fitting gave way, the camera detached and drifted away from him in open water. He watched it move out of reach. Everything he had filmed was on that camera. He had paid $4,000 for the trip, told his audience he was coming back with footage, and the only record of the dive was now floating away from him. He moved toward the camera. He extended both arms out in front of him to reach it and grab it back. Sometimes I wonder why people think the rules exist. The briefing had said it directly. Do not pursue drifting equipment. He had heard it 40 minutes earlier. The camera drifted, and he went for it anyway. The movement was wide, sudden, and uncontrolled. Both arms extended away from his body in open water, with a species briefed specifically as reactive to exactly that kind of stimulus. The guides were positioned several meters away, managing the rest of the group, and could not reach him before the situation developed. He got his hands on the camera. As he pulled back, his posture was still off balance, both arms still extended and away from his body. His attention divided between the camera and reorienting himself. The white tip accelerated from its position and closed the distance. The bite landed on the exposed arm during the recovery phase, single and rapid. The animal disengaged immediately, consistent with investigative bite behavior in the species. The forearm sustained severe vascular damage. The brachial artery was compromised, and blood loss was significant from the first moment. The guides reached him and got him out of the water and onto the vessel as fast as they could manage. Survival depended on rapid surgical intervention that was not achievable in the time available. The vessel turned for shore and emergency services were contacted. Blaine Carter died before reaching land. He was 28 years old. Post-incident review confirmed that Blaine had pursued drifting equipment in direct violation of the briefing, that both arms had been extended away from his body during the recovery attempt, and that his posture at the point of contact was unstable and uncontrolled. Shark behavior was assessed as a typical investigative response to erratic movement in open water. The GoPro was never recovered. No footage from the dive existed. The dive operation reviewed its equipment protocols and subsequently required all participant cameras to be secured with a secondary tether before entry. He went in for footage and came out with nothing. And the part I find tragic is that he paid with his life. January 26th, 2016. The water off the remote volcanic island in the eastern Pacific was cold and extraordinarily clear, the kind of blue-green transparency that makes the ocean floor visible at depth. And the mid-water column looked like something suspended in glass. A light surface chop was running, but nothing significant. The conditions were good for visibility, good for photography, and good for the sharks that came up from deep water to follow the scent of chum drifting down from the surface. I think people often assume cage diving removes the unpredictability from encounters like this. It does not. It only reduces exposure. Ryan Mercer was 31. He had been working on shark diving vessels long enough that the routine of it had become second nature. He understood the behavior of the animals around the cage well enough to anticipate their movements, knew how they tracked the bait, knew the patterns of approach and withdrawal that defined a normal session. He had watched the process repeat itself many times. The knowledge was real. The familiarity was real. That morning, the expedition had run for several hours without significant activity. The water was working against them. The decision was made to chum more heavily, to lay down a stronger scent trail and draw animals up from greater depth. It took time, but eventually, a large great white appeared at distance and began working its way toward the cage, making long, slow investigative passes and tracking the bait line suspended near the surface. The animal was not small. Its movements were deliberate and steady, the kind of behavior that indicates an animal fully committed to investigating, rather than one that might break off and descend again. This is the point where the environment begins shaping the outcome before anyone realizes it. When the session ended and the crew moved to retrieve the bait line, it would not come free. The rope had run beneath the lower outside edge of the cage and caught on a fitting there. From the surface, with the rope running at an angle and the cage in the water, there was no clean way to release it. The snag was accessible from inside the cage if someone could reach the lower edge of the opening. It was the kind of problem that, on a quiet day, would be resolved in under a minute. Ryan moved to the cage opening and partially exited through it to reach the snagged rope below. This is the moment where proximity stopped being theoretical. The great white was still in the water and had not retreated. It was still tracking the bait, still making its passes along the surface, still focused on the thing that had drawn it up from depth in the first place. The shark did not strike at Ryan specifically. It had been committing to an upward run toward the bait for some time, building momentum along the trajectory it had been tracking. What happened at the surface was not a controlled bite. It was a breach. The animal came up hard, made contact, and the force of it cleared the waterline. There was no moment of stillness. There was impact, motion, and then the shark was gone, back below the surface. In the same instant, the crew registered what had happened. One strike, no second approach. The bite to Ryan's torso was severe. The vessel was some distance from shore, and the time required to return to port was not compatible with the injuries he had sustained. Ryan Mercer died before the vessel reached land. He was 31 years old. The cause of death was recorded as severe traumatic injury, consistent with a single-bite shark attack. The bait line was recovered afterward, and the snag was examined. It had caught on a fitting bracket on the exterior lower frame of the cage. The kind of mechanical snag that happens during regular operations. The kind of thing you clear without thinking about it on a day when a large shark is not circling the structure below you. He was buried by his family. The operation was suspended while a full review was conducted of crew proximity protocols during active bait deployment around the cage. The review resulted in a new rule about cage proximity during shark presence that did not exist the day Ryan entered the water. And regulations are often written in direct response to the exact sequence of events that killed someone before the rule existed.
October 3rd, 2018 brought crystal clear conditions to the waters surrounding Isla Guadalupe, Mexico. The remote island, located 150 miles off the Baja California coast, offered some of the clearest water and most predictable great white shark encounters on the planet. Visibility extended over 150 feet in the deep blue water, and the water temperature held steady at 70 degrees Fahrenheit. David Chen, 33, had been looking forward to this night shoot for months, knowing that documenting nocturnal great white behavior could revolutionize understanding of these apex predators. David was an award-winning underwater cinematographer whose work had appeared in National Geographic documentaries and major motion pictures. His passion for shark behavior had led him to specialize in great white footage, and he had spent 5 years filming at Guadalupe Island without incident. He had thousands of hours of great white footage and worked exclusively with the most established and safety-conscious operators in the business. Isla Guadalupe had become the premier destination for great white shark encounters due to its unique geography and marine ecosystem. This topography, combined with abundant seal colonies and nutrient-rich currents, creates perfect conditions for great white sharks. Waters around Guadalupe host one of the largest concentrations of great whites in the world. The great white sharks of Guadalupe are among the largest and most impressive specimens of their species. At 8:30 p.m., David was filming from a specially designed night cage, part of a National Geographic project documenting nocturnal great white behavior that had never been captured on film before. The cage was constructed of reinforced aluminum bars with emergency release mechanisms designed to prevent entrapment if the structure became damaged. David was using cutting-edge equipment, including a new high-intensity LED array that produced 12,000 lumens, significantly brighter than any underwater lighting system previously used for shark filming. Great white sharks are primarily visual hunters that rely heavily on their eyesight to locate and attack prey. What David didn't anticipate was how the intense artificial lighting would affect a massive 17-foot male great white that had been hunting in the area. Great whites have evolved to hunt in specific light conditions, and the powerful LED array began to disorient and agitate the already territorial predator. The artificial lighting disrupted the shark's natural hunting behavior, creating confusion and stress that manifested as increasingly aggressive behavior. The 17-foot male great white, weighing approximately 3,800 pounds, had been patrolling the waters around Guadalupe for several days. This was a mature, experienced predator that had successfully hunted in these waters for years. Male great whites of this size are incredibly territorial and aggressive, especially when their normal behavior patterns are disrupted. Great white sharks possess a complex nervous system that processes visual information with remarkable efficiency. Their brains are specifically adapted to interpret the subtle light patterns and shadows that indicate the presence of prey. When exposed to artificial lighting of extreme intensity, their visual processing system can become overwhelmed, leading to disorientation and aggressive behavior. The shark started exhibiting increasingly erratic behavior, repeatedly ramming the cage with tremendous force. Each impact sent shockwaves through the water and caused the entire cage structure to shake violently. The aluminum bars, designed to withstand the force of a great white attack, began to show stress fractures under the repeated impacts. David continued filming, believing that the cage would protect him from the agitated predator. Great white sharks can generate incredible force when attacking. Their torpedo-shaped bodies, powered by massive tail muscles, can accelerate from 0 to 25 miles per hour in seconds. Shark's behavior became increasingly frenzied as the bright lights continued to disorient its visual system. What should have been a controlled observation session was rapidly deteriorating into a dangerous confrontation between human technology and one of nature's most perfect predators. When David tried to adjust his lighting setup to reduce the shark's agitation, he accidentally triggered the cage's emergency release mechanism, a safety feature designed to prevent entrapment if the cage became damaged during an attack. The top section of the cage opened, creating a 3-foot gap that the massive shark immediately exploited. Great whites are incredibly intelligent predators with excellent spatial awareness. The shark recognized the opening instantly and adjusted its attack pattern to take advantage of the breach in David's defenses. The agitated great white, drawn by the intense lights and David's movements, attacked through the opening with explosive force. This 17-foot individual was already in an excited, aggressive state, and its attack carried the full force of millions of years of evolutionary refinement. The shark's massive jaws, measuring over 18 inches across, clamped down on David's torso with devastating force. The 300 triangular, serrated teeth sliced through his diving equipment and deep into his chest and shoulders. The bite force of 1,800 psi crushed ribs and punctured vital organs, while the shark's brief thrashing motion caused additional trauma as it attempted to drag its prey from the compromised cage. The attack lasted only seconds, but the damage was catastrophic. David's underwater camera continued recording throughout the encounter, capturing footage that would later be used to analyze the incident and improve safety protocols. The images showed the incredible power and speed of a great white attack, as well as the devastating effectiveness of their primary weapon. The boat crew immediately cut all lights and activated emergency protocols, and the sudden darkness seemed to calm the shark, which released its grip and disappeared into the depths as quickly as it had appeared. But the damage was done. David had sustained catastrophic injuries to his cardiovascular and respiratory systems. He was recovered within 90 seconds, a remarkably fast response time that demonstrated the professionalism of the dive crew. But the great white's attack had severed major arteries and crushed vital organs. Despite immediate first aid and emergency medical procedures, David was bleeding internally at a rate that made survival impossible. David died from blood loss and shock before the support vessel could reach the mainland, his final moments captured on the very cameras he had used to document the ocean's apex predators. The footage he had been recording became evidence in the investigation that followed, providing unprecedented insight into great white behavior under artificial lighting conditions. This tragic incident led to new protocols limiting light intensity for all-night filming operations with great whites and requiring backup safety systems for cage diving operations. The investigation revealed that high-intensity artificial lighting could trigger aggressive behavior in great whites, transforming controlled observation sessions into deadly encounters.
It was July 22nd, 2017, Gansbaai, Western Cape, South Africa. A shark cage diving vessel operating off one of the most well-known, great white shark locations in the world. The water was cold, fed by the Benguela Current running up the Atlantic side of the Cape. Baiting had been used to draw sharks to the area, and great whites had been making repeated close passes along the cage since the session began. Curtis Hale was 33. He worked as a sales representative and had been planning this trip for several years. It was his honeymoon. He and his wife had saved for it deliberately, and the shark dive had been one of the experiences they had looked forward to the most. His wife stayed on the vessel and watched from the deck above, while Curtis entered the water with the other participants. Before anyone entered the water, the crew ran a full safety briefing. The no alcohol policy was written into the waiver every participant signed before boarding and was stated again out loud before the dive. The reasoning was straightforward. The environment required complete physical awareness. A submerged cage, surrounded by large predatory animals responding to bait, left no room for any reduction in coordination or spatial judgment. Curtis had brought a flask on board. He consumed alcohol before entering the water. The level of impairment was mild and was not visible to the crew or to anyone else around him. He entered the cage. Let me be fair here. Sometimes alcohol gives you that boost you need, but the truth is that it was not needed in this situation. The session ran without incident through the first portion of the dive. Great whites were moving close to the cage on repeated passes, coming within inches of the vertical bars. The animals were behaving exactly as expected in actively baited water. Curtis was watching them from inside the barrier along with the other participants. At some point during the dive, a great white, estimated at approximately 3.5 meters, made a sudden close pass along the side of the cage. A shark that size moving at speed through enclosed water creates a pressure surge around the cage that participants inside can feel physically. Curtis lost his footing during the pass. He reached upward instinctively to steady himself, and his hand went through the top opening of the cage, past the frame, and into open water above the barrier at the moment the shark was completing its pass at close range. The animal reacted instantly. The bite closed on his hand and forearm at the top of the cage. The shark followed immediately with a brief lateral shake, a natural mechanical response, and the motion wrenched the arm hard against the top frame before anyone above could intervene. The forearm contains the radial and ulnar arteries. Both were torn. Blood loss began immediately, and at a rate the crew had no means to control on the water. Crew responded the moment the incident occurred and pulled Curtis back inside the cage and up to the deck as quickly as possible. His wife was on deck when he came up. Emergency response was initiated immediately, and the vessel turned for shore. The trauma was beyond what could be managed on board. Curtis Hale died before the vessel reached land. He was 33 years old. His wife took his remains home. Post-incident review confirmed that Curtis had consumed alcohol before the dive in direct violation of the policy stated in the waiver and repeated during the briefing. Investigators determined that the impairment was a contributing factor, but identified the primary trigger as the loss of footing during the close pass. The hand placement that followed was instinctive rather than deliberate. No regulatory action was taken against the operator. The company reviewed its boarding and pre-entry checks following the incident. It was their honeymoon. His wife was on the deck. He signed the waiver. He brought the flask. One stumble, one bad grip. She took him home. April 14th, 2017. Low tide. The mangrove forest along that stretch of the tidal delta sits in a place where the ordinary boundaries between land and water stop making sense. The root systems emerge from the mud in dense formations that make forward movement slow and linear navigation close to impossible. The tidal creeks carry sound that fills every silence and masks the sounds of movement. Arjun Mehta was 46. He had been setting and retrieving crab traps in those tidal channels for years, returning each season to the same sections of waterway where the catches he knew were reliable. The income it produced was not substantial, but it was consistent, and the knowledge required to do it. Which channels held the best traps, which tidal windows to work, how to move a small flat-bottom boat through the root systems without losing the current, had taken years to develop. He was not an outsider to that place. He was someone who had been going there long enough to feel comfortable in it, which in those particular waters is its own kind of risk. I think about that distinction often. There is a version of competence that protects you, and there is a version that quietly removes the hesitation that was protecting you all along. The zone he entered that morning was restricted to civilians. The patrol boats ran along the waterways in the early hours, and the window before they arrived was the window Arjun had always used. He entered alone, as he usually did, and moved into the interior channels. The area was closed for a reason that had nothing to do with administration. Bull sharks moved through it regularly during the tidal exchange, and the turbidity of the water made detecting their presence functionally impossible until the distance between a person and the animal had already collapsed to something that could not be recovered from. This was not theoretical. It was the documented, recorded reason the restrictions existed. This is important to understand because the restriction was not bureaucratic. It was behavioral. Arjun had been working his traps for some time when the mullet near the surface began moving. In that delta, among the people who have spent their lives working those channels, a sudden push of surface fish carries an unambiguous meaning. It is not triggered by current or by debris moving through the water. It is directional, concentrated, and consistent with something large moving below the surface. People who know those channels treat it as a signal to stop and assess before doing anything else. A bull shark had been moving through the channel on the tidal current, drawn in by the fish activity and the vibration of trap retrieval carrying through the water. The turbidity compressed the encounter distance to almost nothing. It was not tracking Arjun specifically. It was already close, already oriented toward the disturbance, already within the range where the environment had made the outcome difficult to avoid. This is the part that I think people find hardest to accept, that there was no decision made about him, that the animal was simply already there, doing what the water and the current and the vibration had pulled it toward doing. When Arjun leaned over the side of his boat to pull a trap from the channel floor, the shark was already close. The strike came from below, from within the turbid water, at a range that left no reaction time. The force of it pulled him from the boat. Workers in the surrounding area heard something, the boat moving, a sound in the water, and then the channel went quiet again. By the time they understood what the sound had been and located the general area, Arjun was gone. He was not recovered alive. I have read accounts from people who were present for the search, and the detail that stays with me is how ordinary the channel looked by the time they reached it. The water does not hold the shape of what happened in it. Arjun Mehta was 46 years old. The cause of death was consistent with a shark attack, with severe traumatic injuries to the upper body. The patrol boats ran their morning routes as usual. The others found him later that morning in the shallows, near where his boat had drifted to the bank. He had not survived the water. The traps he had come to retrieve were still full. That image stayed with me for a long time afterward. Not the violence of what happened, but the stillness of what was left. The boat against the bank. The traps undisturbed. The ordinary evidence of a morning that had been interrupted before it finished. I have spent a long time with cases from that delta. The detail in Arjun's story that I cannot move past is the mullet. They were moving, visibly, suddenly, in the exact way that water behaves when something below it is actively closing in. He had been going into those channels long enough to know that delta. Whether he understood what he was seeing that morning, I genuinely do not know. Whether he saw it and kept reaching over the side anyway, I also do not know. I am not sure which of those two possibilities is harder to sit with, because either possibility leads to the same conclusion. The water warned him before the shark arrived. It was June 14, 2018, in Islamorada, Florida Keys, and the water off Islamorada was doing what it always does in early summer, flat and blue and indifferent. The kind of morning that makes bad decisions feel like good ones. Marcus Obeya, 34, was an experienced freediver and spearfisher from Miami who had increasingly begun diving alone and pushing deeper breath hold limits, and he had grown dismissive of the most basic rule in spearfishing. You do not keep bleeding fish on your body while you keep diving in waters known for bull sharks and hammerheads. You put your catch in a float bag, tethered at the surface. Divers who had told him as much described being brushed off with the patient condescension of a man who believed his experience had made him exempt. He paddled out alone to his preferred reef spot at around 7:30 a.m. The reef sat in 18 to 22 feet of water, known for grouper and snapper. Within the first 30 minutes, he had shot 2 yellowtail snapper and clipped them to a short wire stringer on a D-ring at his left hip. Both fish were alive and bleeding. Bull sharks are common in the Florida Keys and are known to respond quickly to the scent of bleeding fish. Bull sharks have one of the highest bite forces recorded among sharks of comparable size, aided by a stocky body and short, broad snout designed for high-impact strikes. A wire stringer of dying snapper clipped to a free-diving human in a Florida reef system is not an ambiguous situation for a bull shark. It is a food source. The 2 sharks that appeared around 8:20 a.m. had probably been tracking the blood trail for several minutes before Marcus noticed the first one. A large bull moving in slow, deliberate arcs along the reef structure about 25 feet below him. He spotted it on his descent. He recognized immediately what it was and what it meant. He decided to ascend carefully. He didn't know there was a second one. The second bull had been tracking the blood plume from the opposite direction, approaching from behind and below at an angle Marcus had no way to see. It covered the last 15 feet at full speed. Marcus was at approximately 12 feet of depth when 300 pounds of shark hit him in the left side like a thrown vehicle. 2 ribs fractured on impact. The force drove him sideways through the water, his mask flooding, his spear gun torn from his grip. The shark's momentum carried it past him, but it circled back in less than 2 seconds, its jaws already open. It bit down on his left hip, jaws closing around the wire stringer, the 2 snapper, and the section of wetsuit and flesh beneath them. The stringer snapped. The shark pulled away with the fish, the D-ring hardware, a ragged section of his 3mm wetsuit, and a significant portion of the soft tissue of his left hip and outer thigh. The femoral artery was not severed in that bite. He was thrashing now. He couldn't help it. The pain and the shock and the flood of adrenaline made controlled movement impossible. The first bull shark, which had been circling the reef structure below during the initial attack, responded to the blood and the thrashing. It came up fast and hit Marcus from the front, jaws closing around his right forearm and lower bicep as he reached toward the surface. He felt the teeth and then felt the pull as the shark twisted its body. 2 fingers were gone when the shark released. A significant portion of his forearm went with it. Marcus reached the surface, screaming. A nearby fishing vessel responded to Marcus's screams and pulled him aboard. The Coast Guard arrived within minutes, and he was airlifted to a trauma center in Miami. He died during surgery 6 hours later from massive blood loss caused by vascular trauma to his left thigh. The authorities responded to the site that afternoon. 2 bull sharks were observed in the vicinity, but neither was captured. They issued a 72-hour public advisory recommending divers avoid the reef. Marcus's family sued the kayak rental company that had launched him that morning, alleging inadequate safety briefing, but it was dismissed.